Lewis Hamilton was sabotaged today at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix after the team overloaded his car with fuel, adding extra weight and slowing him down. Stay tuned until the end to discover Hamilton's furious reaction and what shocking details are set to leak across social media tomorrow. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. What unfolded on the streets of Baku today has already spiraled into one of the most explosive and unsettling controversies of modern Formula One. An episode that people will be dissecting for years, not just because of the bizarre way the race disintegrated for Lewis Hamilton, but because of the chilling revelations that emerged from deep inside Ferrari's own garage. At first glance, the final classification looked confusing rather than catastrophic. Hamilton limped home in 8th, a result that on paper might seem like another off day, another example of Ferrari failing to convert potential into performance. For the casual viewer, it could be dismissed as a lack of pace, perhaps another messy strategy call, or just plain misfortune. But to those with their ears close to the whispers of the paddock, it became immediately obvious that something far darker had unfolded. This wasn't a tactical blunder. This wasn't an unlucky break. According to people inside the team itself, this was either a monumental miscalculation that defies all logic or an act so suspicious it borders on deliberate sabotage. Fuel is everything in Formula One. It is calculated down to the last drop with military precision. Entire departments run simulations for every conceivable race scenario: safety cars, red flags, tire degradation models, even unexpected changes in weather, to ensure the car carries the exact amount required. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Carry a few kilos too many, and you sacrifice lap time, tire life, and car balance. But what Hamilton was given in Baku went beyond an ordinary error. According to those close to the situation, Ferrari rolled his car onto the grid with a fuel load so grotesquely excessive that the car was doomed before the lights even went out. What should have been a finely tuned machine ready to attack was instead a lumbering heavyweight, shackled by dead weight that crushed his performance from the opening corner. Rivals were stunned when they learned the numbers, openly questioning whether it was even possible for such a mistake to happen unintentionally. Hamilton himself sensed disaster almost immediately. Within the first handful of laps, his voice on the radio revealed disbelief. He described a car that felt unresponsive, stubborn through the turns, heavy in all the wrong places. "It feels like it's dragging an anchor," he snapped at one point, his tone carrying equal parts fury and disbelief. Each lap became a painful reminder of the mistake. Cars he would normally outclass with ease swept past him as though he were standing still. He fought desperately, trying to extract life from a machine crippled by its own burden, but there was nothing he could do. His frustration bled through the radio waves. Questions turned into demands, disbelief became fury, and still, the Ferrari pit wall refused to tell him the full story. He was left alone, humiliated, strapped into a car that was never going to compete, enduring every lap as an exercise in futility. The television cameras only captured fragments of his misery: the shake of his head in the cockpit, the aggressive hand gestures, the darkened expression each time he rolled down the pit straight. But those who had access to the raw, unfiltered radio feed heard the fire in his voice. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. Yet the replies from the pit wall were vague, evasive, almost patronizing, as though the engineers themselves were unwilling, or perhaps unable, to confront the truth in real time. And so, Hamilton drove on, locked in a nightmare that was invisible to the casual viewer but obvious to every insider listening. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The paddock erupted in the aftermath. Rival engineers could not fathom how Ferrari had managed to commit such a grotesque error. They whispered about systemic dysfunction, about an organization so fractured that even its most basic calculations were failing. But others spoke more quietly, their voices carrying something colder: suspicion. Could this truly have been an accident? Could a team with Ferrari's experience, with its resources and checks and balances, really allow such a catastrophic blunder to slip through undetected? Or was there something more sinister at play? Was someone within the team working against its own driver, undermining Hamilton in a way so subtle that it could later be brushed off as a mistake? The possibility, once raised, spread like wildfire, infecting every conversation in the paddock with doubt. When Hamilton returned to the garage after the race, his demeanor spoke volumes. Witnesses described his face as stone, his eyes blazing with a fury barely held in check. He refused to engage with team members, brushing past mechanics, ignoring engineers, and walking straight through the Ferrari hospitality unit without uttering a single word. Those who attempted to approach him stopped in their tracks, frozen by the sheer intensity of his presence. He was not just disappointed, he was incensed, convinced that he had been let down in a way that went far beyond sporting error. This was not merely a bad race, this was betrayal, and the weight of it left scars that may never heal. Inside the team, the atmosphere was suffocating. Engineers avoided eye contact, whispers filled the corridors, and senior staff scrambled to contain the damage. Publicly, they attempted to downplay the incident, insisting it was a miscalculation. But privately, the questions were relentless. Who had signed off on the fuel load? How had such a discrepancy slipped through every safety net? Why had no one intervened when the numbers looked so obviously wrong? The silence from Ferrari only deepened the suspicion, fueling conspiracy theories that spread across the paddock like wildfire. Meanwhile, rival teams seized the moment. Some bosses quietly fanned the flames, suggesting that Hamilton's relationship with Ferrari was irreparably broken. Others hinted that this was the tipping point, that his patience had finally snapped, that he would already be exploring exit strategies. Drivers, too, whispered in corners, some sympathetic, others gleeful, each one aware that the collapse of Hamilton's trust in Ferrari could reshape the entire balance of power in Formula One. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. By the time the sun set over Baku, the narrative was clear: this was no ordinary blunder. This was a scandal that cut to the very heart of Ferrari's credibility. For Hamilton, it was a humiliation he would not forget, the day his so-called dream with the Scuderia turned into a nightmare broadcast for the world to see. And for Formula One as a whole, it was a moment of chaos and intrigue that ensured everyone, from fans to insiders to rivals, was left asking the same burning question: was this incompetence, or was it betrayal? When the checkered flag waved and Hamilton dragged his battered Ferrari across the finish line in a miserable 8th place, the explosion of tension was instantaneous and impossible to ignore. The moment he unbuckled his harness, the rage that had been building throughout the race finally erupted, visible in every line of his face. His eyes were ablaze, his jaw was locked, and his movements were sharp and violent, stripped of the polished composure that usually defined him in the public eye. He tore off his gloves as though they were shackles, yanked off the steering wheel with a force that betrayed his fury, and hurled his helmet onto the seat without a second glance. The car that had once been presented to him as a symbol of Ferrari's rebirth now stood behind him like a cruel mockery, an ally turned traitor, a machine that had betrayed him in front of millions. Ignoring the swarm of journalists, the crush of photographers, and the barrage of questions hurled at him in the pit lane, Hamilton walked with a pace that bordered on a march. His stride was fast, aggressive, and purposeful, his gaze fixed on the glowing red motorhome that loomed in the distance like a battlefield command post. Reporters shouted his name, cameras flashed relentlessly, and even fans leaning over the barriers tried to reach him with desperate cries, but he was unreachable, consumed by a storm that no outside force could calm. Witnesses said the paddock seemed to hold its breath as he cut through it, as though every single person sensed that the eruption to come would leave scars. When Hamilton arrived at the doors of Ferrari's headquarters, he did not slow, did not knock, did not offer even the faintest acknowledgement to the staff who instinctively tried to halt his progress. He shoved past with raw determination, his fury carrying him like momentum, and the door slammed behind him with a sound that reverberated like thunder through the motorhome's walls. Inside, Frederick Vasseur sat with the engineers, already pale and uneasy, waiting for a debrief they suspected would be tense. What followed, however, shattered every expectation. The silence lasted barely seconds before Hamilton's voice ripped through the room, a sound so raw and commanding it made even seasoned professionals flinch. Those who overheard from the hallway later described his words as some of the most blistering accusations ever delivered in Formula One. His voice thundered with outrage, laced with disbelief and a sense of personal betrayal. He accused the team of orchestrating his downfall, of robbing him not only of the chance to fight for glory but of his dignity as one of the sport's greatest champions. He did not temper his fury, he let it pour out in relentless waves. He demanded explanations, demanded accountability, and demanded to know how such incompetence could fester in a team with Ferrari's resources, legacy, and pride. He spat the question of how the Scuderia could commit an error so elementary that even a struggling backmarker would have avoided it. His fury was not just about the race, it was about the larger betrayal he felt. Hamilton reminded them with cutting intensity of what he had sacrificed to sit in that very room, of the colossal gamble he took by leaving Mercedes, the team where he had been family, for the promise of Maranello's rebirth. He recalled the pledges that had been made, the whispered assurances that Ferrari would give him the machinery to fight for immortality, the vision that had convinced him to wrap himself in red. One by one, He tore those promises apart, shredding them in front of Vasseur and his staff with the precision of someone who had reached his breaking point. His voice carried venom as he accused the organization of incompetence at best, deception at worst, and finally, in words that sent shockwaves through those listening, he hinted openly at sabotage. The word hung in the air like poison. Sabotage. It was not the kind of accusation casually thrown in the heat of the moment. It was a bomb, a direct challenge to the integrity of those in the room. He demanded to know if the mistake was truly accidental or if someone, somewhere inside Ferrari, had conspired to ensure his downfall. He questioned whether he had been set up to fail, whether there were forces within the team who would rather see him broken than triumphant. His tone was not speculative, it was accusatory, sharpened by rage and despair, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss it as mere frustration. Vasseur, stunned and visibly shaken, tried to calm him, to respond, to salvage control of the situation, but every attempt was crushed beneath Hamilton's fury. Each word from the team principal was cut off, drowned out by Hamilton's escalating anger. The engineers, who moments earlier had been scribbling notes and adjusting data sheets, sat frozen, their eyes downcast, as though afraid to look him in the face. Mechanics and staff outside the closed door reported hearing the walls vibrate with the sheer force of his shouting, the cadence of a man who felt betrayed not just professionally but personally. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The motorhome itself seemed to quake under the weight of the storm. When Hamilton finally paused, chest heaving, his silence was no less suffocating than his rage had been. The damage was done, the fracture unmistakable. The fragile relationship between Hamilton and Ferrari, already strained, had shattered in front of everyone. What remained in that room was not a partnership but a battlefield, littered with accusations, broken trust, and the undeniable sense that something irreversible had taken place. Those who were present behind the closed doors of the Ferrari motorhome that evening describe it as a scene that could have been lifted from a psychological thriller, the kind of confrontation where the tension is so thick it seems to choke the air itself. The usually unflappable Frédéric Vasseur, a man celebrated for his composure, for his ability to stay rational when chaos erupts, was stripped of all that calm in front of Lewis Hamilton's relentless rage. His features were drained of color, his expression drawn tight with strain, his shoulders rigid as though bracing himself against a storm. Each accusation hurled at him by Hamilton landed with a crushing impact, shattering the fragile atmosphere of professionalism that Ferrari's leadership had tried to uphold. It was not the voice of a driver asking for explanations. It was the voice of a man who felt betrayed, humiliated, and dragged into a nightmare he never believed could happen at the most prestigious team in the world. Vasseur attempted to rally, forcing words through clenched teeth, insisting that what had happened was nothing more than a technical miscalculation, a misinterpretation of highly complex data within the labyrinth of modern fuel modeling. He spoke of numbers, algorithms, margins of error so small that they should have been invisible, errors that ballooned into disaster when amplified over the course of a Grand Prix. But Hamilton was deaf to those explanations. He was beyond patience. He cut off the Frenchman's sentences midstream, his voice rising in sharp bursts, his tone thick with fury and disbelief. His words were not just criticism, they were daggers. He told Vasseur he hadn't come to Ferrari to be embarrassed in front of the world, that he would not tolerate being made into a pawn in a circus of incompetence. His voice shook the room, his glare pinned everyone in place, and when he brought his palm down against the table with a thunderous crack, the sound made the walls tremble and the staff around him recoil as if they themselves had been struck. What he called the team's failure was not just a mistake in his eyes. It was a disgrace, a humiliation so profound it stained not only his personal reputation but the Ferrari name itself. He accused them of dragging his legacy through the dirt, of ripping apart the trust that is the foundation of every great partnership between driver and machine. Without trust, he thundered, there is no strategy, no success, no future. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, suffocating, inescapable, leaving silence in their wake that was more terrifying than the shouts themselves. The room itself seemed to shrink under the weight of his fury. Engineers who had moments earlier been discussing adjustments to the car sat motionless, their eyes glued to the floor. Mechanics froze, tools clenched in their hands, too afraid to shift even slightly in their seats. Junior members of the team, many experiencing their first season in Formula One, were visibly shaken. Some tried to blink back tears. Others couldn't bear the pressure, slipping quietly out the back of the motorhome, desperate to escape the storm before it consumed them completely. Witnesses later recalled that the atmosphere was so heavy, so toxic, that simply breathing felt like a struggle. The sound of Hamilton's rage lingered long after the words themselves had been spoken, reverberating in the skulls of everyone in that room. And yet, behind the fear, there was something else, something darker. Among the whispers of the more seasoned insiders, those who had seen Maranello's inner workings for years, there was agreement that Hamilton's anger, though terrifying, was justified. This was not a trivial error. This was not a marginal mistake. This was a collapse on a scale unthinkable for a team of Ferrari's stature. In Formula One, the margin between success and failure is razor-thin. Fractions of seconds, milliliters of fuel, microscopic deviations in calculations. For such an error to occur in a team with Ferrari's resources suggested something beyond simple incompetence. It hinted at deeper fractures, at shadows moving inside the organization that no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. And so, the speculation began. Could this be merely the result of oversight? Or had Hamilton's presence stirred forces within Ferrari that wished to see him fail? In the complex political web of Maranello, where egos clash as fiercely as engines, where tradition and power struggles often weigh heavier than innovation, nothing could be dismissed. Some suggested that factions within the team, resistant to Hamilton's influence, resentful of his reputation and authority, might have seen him as a threat. What better way to weaken him than to orchestrate a public humiliation, to strip him of dignity before the world, to remind him that Ferrari belongs not to the driver but to those who control it from within? These whispers spread quickly through the paddock. Other teams watched from afar, sensing that something monumental had cracked within Ferrari's walls. Rival engineers spoke in hushed tones about sabotage, while commentators speculated on live television whether Hamilton would ever forgive what had just happened. Those closest to him claimed that the trust had been shattered beyond repair, that this was the moment the dream of Hamilton in Ferrari Red turned into a nightmare. What had once been a partnership brimming with promise was now poisoned by suspicion, anger, and betrayal. When Hamilton finally stormed out of the motorhome, the silence he left behind was deafening. Staff members sat shell-shocked, too afraid to move, too broken to speak. Vasseur himself, pale and visibly shaken, slumped into his chair, his attempts at control obliterated by the sheer force of Hamilton's fury. In that instant, the myth of Ferrari as an unbreakable institution seemed to fracture. The echoes of the confrontation would ripple outward, igniting questions not just about strategy or mistakes, but about the very survival of the alliance between one of the greatest drivers in history and the most storied team in Formula One. What makes the entire situation burn with such intensity is not only the disaster on track, but the long history of frustrations that have poisoned Hamilton's relationship with Ferrari since the very first races he contested in red. The partnership was presented to the world as destiny fulfilled, the final chapter in an already illustrious career, the union of a modern icon with the most legendary name in motorsport. But what was supposed to be poetry has instead unraveled into a string of nightmares. Time after time, strategy calls collapsed in real time, pit walls faltered under pressure, upgrades promised to transform the car fell flat, and every attempt to convince Hamilton that a brighter future awaited was betrayed by another crushing disappointment. His belief, once genuine, has been chipped away like stone ground to dust, every mistake gnawing at his patience, every blunder reducing his trust. And then came the breaking point, the moment when anger turned into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. To give him a machine hobbled by unnecessary weight, overloaded with fuel that killed his chances before the lights even went out, was to reduce one of the most precise drivers in the history of the sport into a victim of incompetence. For Hamilton, whose entire identity has been built on exactness, on details measured to perfection, on extracting fractions of a second through flawless preparation, to be forced into combat with such a self-inflicted handicap was not only unacceptable, it was humiliating. This was not simply a technical error. This was, in his eyes, a betrayal, a deliberate insult to the standards that have defined his career. Champions can forgive defeat when outpaced by brilliance, but they cannot forgive being sabotaged by the very people meant to empower them. The paddock tonight buzzes with an energy that borders on hysteria. Behind every closed door, voices lower to whispers, but those whispers spread like wildfire. Some insiders murmur that Hamilton's patience has reached its end, that this incident has snapped the last fragile thread connecting him to Frédéric Vasseur and the Maranello hierarchy. Others claim rival teams are already positioning themselves, sensing the vulnerability, circling like predators around wounded prey. The thought of Hamilton leaving Ferrari prematurely, tearing up what was once considered the golden contract of the decade, no longer sounds far-fetched, it sounds inevitable. For Ferrari, the disgrace is monumental, a stain that no amount of victories elsewhere could easily cleanse. To have one of the greatest champions alive suggest, even indirectly, that he has been betrayed or undermined by the team itself, is a humiliation that echoes louder than any lost race. The proud Red Empire, so often defended by the passion of its tifosi, now risks being remembered not for glory but for dysfunction, indecision, and failure. Fans across Italy and beyond, those who carried banners, flags, and faith, now stare in disbelief, wondering if they have been cheering for a dream that never truly existed. The media devours the scandal with insatiable hunger, every outlet eager to paint the drama in blood-red tones. Headlines explode with words like sabotage, betrayal, and champion destroyed from within. Talk shows dissect the event minute by minute, journalists speculate about Hamilton's fury behind closed doors, and rival fans seize the chance to mock Ferrari's collapse. It is no longer a story confined to motorsport. It has become global news, a narrative of trust shattered and a sporting giant exposed as flawed and fragile. Meanwhile, rival teams sense the tremor shaking the foundations of Maranello. Mercedes, watching with quiet calculation, imagines the possibility of rewriting history, of bringing their prodigal son back into the fold and reigniting the bond that once defined an era of dominance. Red Bull, never shy of capitalizing on chaos, is rumored to have opened discreet channels, whispering of a chance to create an unbeatable super team. Even Audi, preparing for its full-scale arrival, is mentioned in hushed tones as a potential player in this drama, willing to throw open its resources to lure a legend into their project. The paddock is alive with predators who smell blood, and Ferrari has unwittingly painted its own hero as wounded prey. And yet, through all the noise, one truth remains clear: Hamilton is no ordinary driver, and this is no ordinary scandal. This is the unraveling of faith, the collapse of a dream sold to the world as destiny, and the awakening of a champion who refuses to allow incompetence or betrayal to define the closing chapters of his career. The decision he makes in the coming days will not only determine his own future but will ripple through Formula One for years, shaking alliances, altering strategies, and rewriting legacies. The air tonight feels heavier than usual, as though every garage, every fan, every journalist understands they are witnessing more than a sporting controversy. They are watching history twist before their eyes. The question is no longer whether Hamilton can endure another failure, but whether Ferrari can survive the storm they themselves have unleashed. When Hamilton stepped out of the motorhome, the entire atmosphere of the paddock seemed to shift in an instant, as though an invisible storm had broken loose. His expression was carved into something beyond anger, an icy, venomous glare that carried a message more devastating than any words he could have shouted. He didn't slow, didn't offer a single phrase to the wall of microphones and flashing cameras that lunged toward him. He simply brushed past, radiating a fury so intense that even the most hardened journalists stepped back. It wasn't just a scowl, it was the look of a man who had been betrayed in the deepest possible way, the look of a champion who realized in real time that the very foundation of trust he had built with his team had been obliterated. Those who know Hamilton best, those who have lived through his fiercest rivalries, crushing defeats, and triumphant comebacks, were quick to admit they had never seen him like this. His body language was explosive yet controlled, as if every muscle was fighting to contain an eruption. This wasn't the frustration of a strategy error, nor the sting of a botched pit stop. This was something far more corrosive. This was the moment when a driver felt his own team had crossed an unforgivable line. Ferrari was never meant to be just another chapter in his career. It was supposed to be his legacy, the fabled red car beneath him as he cemented himself alongside the immortals of the sport. And yet here in Baku, the dream collapsed in spectacular fashion, transforming into a nightmare of suspicion, bitterness, and betrayal. The paddock was electric with whispers. Conversations behind closed doors turned feverish, mechanics and engineers leaning into one another, voices hushed but urgent. Had Ferrari simply buckled under pressure and committed one of the most disastrous mistakes of recent memory? Or had they, in some unfathomable calculation, decided to undercut the very man they had built their future around? The theories spread like wildfire, because nothing about Hamilton's reaction suggested this was a simple miscommunication. The look in his eyes told a darker story, one that hinted at sabotage, mistrust, and fractures so deep they might never be repaired. The consequences will not fade quietly. This is a scandal destined to engulf Formula One, to ripple through every media outlet, every fan forum, every team debrief for weeks and possibly months to come. The image of Hamilton storming away in silence will be replayed endlessly, analyzed frame by frame, as pundits and insiders dissect whether Ferrari had destroyed their own golden ticket to glory. Rivals will pounce on the chaos, sniffing weakness, probing for opportunities to lure Hamilton away or destabilize Maranello further. The headlines will not focus on lap times or overtakes. They will scream of betrayal, fury, and a partnership on the brink of collapse. And as for the race itself, its official result has already been swallowed whole by the storm. The name of the victor will drift into irrelevance, a mere statistic overshadowed by the firestorm of controversy. Years from now, when fans speak of Baku, they will not speak of podiums or champagne. They will recall the day Hamilton's trust in Ferrari disintegrated before the entire world. They will remember the glare that froze cameras mid-click, the silence that roared louder than any protest, and the scandal that cracked the very foundations of the Scuderia. This was not merely a tense afternoon. It was an eruption that shook the sport to its core, a betrayal so profound it will echo across the history of Formula One, leaving behind broken loyalties, lingering accusations, and the unshakable sense that a line had been crossed, never to be uncrossed again.